But today, our attention wasn't focused on the tree, which, by the way, was perfect for climbing with its low-hanging branches, but on a putrid heap near its roots. I could hear the buzzing of flies from here, and it grew louder as we approached. The stench of decay quickly became so intense that I held the sleeve of my jacket to my nose. Ugh, this is disgusting. I heard Lars whine from behind me. He stood at a distance from the carcass. Clara and I were less squeamish. Curiously, we approached the dead animal. When we stood right in front of it, even I had to swallow. I had seen quite a few deer in my life. Dead ones too, up close. But what lay before us could hardly be identified as a deer anymore. Its body was completely torn apart. The fur was dark red. The entrails were ripped out and unidentifiable shreds and blood were scattered all around the carcass. No wonder even Dr. Novak couldn't identify the attacker. As Mrs. Richter had said earlier, the scavengers must have done a thorough job of obliterating the traces. Suddenly, I felt like I was being watched. I quickly turned to Lars, but he had his back turned to us, apparently trying to avoid looking at the carcass. So, my eyes wandered further, but there were only trees as far as I could see. Finally, my gaze fell upon the trunk of the large oak tree. I paused. Right in front of me, about 2 meters above the ground, there was a bloody imprint on the bark. It almost looked like a handprint. Perplexed, I looked up. The sun sparkled through the canopy of leaves. I saw the many branching and twisting branches above me. There was the old tree house I had mentioned earlier. "Are you looking for something?" Clara interrupted my thoughts. "You won't find anything up there. Or do you think the deer was pecked to death by a bird?" She chuckled as I looked at her. "No, not that. But do you think it looks like a handprint?" I pointed to the red stain on the bark. Curiously, Clara approached the trunk. She examined the imprint for a while before finally responding. I don't know. It could be, but the human brain tends to interpret familiar shapes in shapeless stains. That's why we see faces everywhere, even when the shapes only vaguely resemble a mouth and 2 eyes." She shrugged. By now, Lars had joined us as well. "If you ask me," he said, holding his nose, "it could also have been a bird. This could have been the wing." He pointed to the indentation that I had interpreted as fingers. I furrowed my brow. I could see it too. But why would a blood-soaked bird fly into the tree? Maybe a scavenger. A startled crow. But the imprint seemed rather small for a crow. The others had already stopped paying attention to it. "Can't you track or something?" "Your dad is a hunter, right?" Lars suggested. I raised an eyebrow as I turned away from the bloodstain. Then I examined the ground more closely. "Oh, you're right," I exclaimed excitedly. I took a step towards Lars, and he immediately stepped aside to make room for me. Yes, right here." I paused for dramatic effect and grinned at Lars. Right here stood a pretty big idiot who has watched too many movies. I pointed to his shoe print in the grass. "Ha ha ha. Very funny," he replied, but couldn't help but smile. "Sorry, maybe more experienced hunters can do that, but when I'm out with Dad, we usually just sit in some hunting blind and wait." I decided not to rub it in his face that I had never actually shot an animal myself. A little later, away from the stench, we huddled over a map of the forest, marking the locations where we had found the carcasses so far. We were discussing our next steps, planning to systematically search the affected areas in a grid pattern, when suddenly a scream pierced through the forest. It was loud, but it didn't sound like any animal I knew, nor like a human. If I had to categorize it, I would say it sounded frightened, perhaps some kind of warning. "What was that?" Clara asked, immediately scanning the area for the source of the sound. Lars remained casual. "Probably just some animal. I heard foxes scream in a video once. It sounded similar," he explained. Unfortunately, I had to shatter his illusion. "That wasn't a fox. I've never heard an animal like that here. And I've been in the woods damn often." We exchanged meaningful glances. I held my rifle tightly in my hands, ready to unlock it as we moved as a tightly knit group towards the source of the scream. We silently crept alongside each other for a while, being careful to make as little noise as possible. However, we didn't see or hear anything unusual around us anymore. There were just the birds incessantly chirping, the wind rustling through the leaves, and the sound of a stream that we were getting closer to. Judging by the sounds, we were heading straight towards it. When we finally saw the water, I grimaced. The stream was quite wide. If we didn't want to get our feet wet, we would have to find a narrower spot. Wordlessly, we walked along the stream, keeping our eyes and ears wide open. Suddenly, Lars grabbed me by the jacket. I immediately stopped. "Look," he said to us, pointing at an imprint in the muddy bank that I'd almost stepped into. Curiously, I bent down. It was a footprint, a human footprint, and it looked quite fresh. Maybe the scream was indeed from a person, I pondered aloud. If some guys were just fooling around here. And what if it's really a ghost? Lars interjected. Clara and I looked at him incredulously. Nonsense. The imprint is probably from someone who wanted to dangle their feet in the water. Besides, I've never heard of ghosts going barefoot, I replied. Or naked, Clara added. It took me a moment to understand what she was getting at. She was referring to the naked man. The puzzle pieces in my head began to come together. Didn't you say the man had bloody hands? I asked. Clara nodded. And wasn't there a bloody handprint on the tree trunk? I added. Now it clicked for my friends as well. Are you suggesting that some crazy person is running naked through the woods and killing animals? Lars voiced it out loud. I don't know. Maybe. I can only say what it looks like, I explained. Maybe we should call the police, Clara interjected. If it really is a madman, he could be dangerous. Well, we have a rifle, I replied. If we stick together. But Clara didn't let me finish. And what if he also has a weapon? We were on our way back, only a few meters away, when I noticed something on the ground near one of the trees. Curiously, I approached it. Wait a minute, I said as I bent down. There on the ground was another imprint of a naked human foot. It led directly to the tree, just a few inches from the trunk, as if someone had stretched against it, or as if they had climbed up the tree. I quickly looked up, but before a scream could escape my lips, another scream erupted. A naked man crouched in the tree above me. He had pale skin, no hair on his head, was emaciated, and he lunged at me, screaming. The force of the impact knocked me down. I fell on my back onto some roots, but my head was cushioned by soft forest soil. However, I couldn't manage to raise the rifle. Not only was the man perched on top of me with his bony body, but he also struck me wildly, forcing me to shield my face and neck with my arms. All the while, he continued screaming like a madman. Florian! Clara and Lars screamed simultaneously. Lars was immediately by my side. I saw him lunge at the man, but at the last moment, the man kicked him. With a skill I wouldn't have expected in his condition, he struck Lars's face with his bare foot. A mix of a slap and a crack resonated. My friend held his nose as he staggered back a few steps and eventually fell. Lars! I cried out, but I had no chance to rush to him. The man still crouched over me, wildly beating me. While the fabric of my jacket absorbed the worst blows, spit landed on my face. And then there was that terrible stench. His hands were covered in dried blood, as Clara had said, but I couldn't tell if it was the blood or his breath that reeked so horribly of decay. Suddenly, a thud. Sound echoed. I had no idea if Clara had aimed at his head or if it was pure luck. Nevertheless, the man jumped aside as the stone struck his temple with full force. But that didn't disable him for long. Before I could even sit up, he crawled over me on all fours and sprinted towards Clara with almost inhuman speed. His movements reminded me more of an animal than a human. However, I hesitated after unlocking the weapon and aiming it at him. Clara was directly in my line of fire. In the last moment, I raised the barrel and fired a warning shot. The gunshot reverberated through the entire forest. I heard countless birds take flight in alarm. A chorus of wing flaps filled the air from all directions. However, the strange man seemed completely unfazed by the sound. He continued charging towards Clara, simply pulling her down to the ground. I immediately reloaded, neatly catching the spent cartridge as Papa had taught me, and aimed at the attacker once again. Then everything happened very quickly. While aiming, I saw that the naked man was crouched over Clara. He had picked up a large stone, poised to strike. I had no time to think, only to act. Another shot echoed through the forest. This time, I hadn't raised the barrel at the last second. The bullet hit its mark precisely. The man screamed. His cries sounded similar to the earlier scream, but much more agonizing. He released Clara and, with pain whimpering, curled up on the ground beside her. He pressed his hands tightly against the fresh wound in his stomach, inflicted by the shot I fired. I quickly got up. I ran to Clara to see if she was okay, but she was already back on her feet before I reached her. And apart from a likely broken nose, Lars seemed to be fine as well. We formed a circle around the strange naked man, keeping a safe distance. It was a pitiful sight to see him crying and whimpering on the ground. Yet, he didn't respond to our questions and calls. It seemed as if he was more animal than human. Now that the man was no longer perched on top of me and not moving too much, I could clearly observe him. He was unnaturally thin, much thinner than a person with his strength should be. The absence of hair on his head was not the only thing missing. He had no body hair, neither on his arms and legs, nor on his chest or in the genital area. He didn't even have eyebrows or eyelashes. The longer I looked at him, the more uncertain I became if this thing was truly a human. When I spoke of a monster in the woods, I didn't actually expect a real monster. I assumed we would encounter a rabid dog or something similar. But this... What do we do now? Clara asked nervously. Let's get out of here, Lars said. He's done for, right? Shit, we shot a man. I considered agreeing with him for a moment, but aside from not knowing what would happen if someone found his body, I couldn't bring myself to just leave him here. It was a gut shot. If I hadn't hit any vital organs, he had a good chance of surviving. It turned out to be the right decision. After an emergency medical team retrieved him from the forest, they immediately took him to the hospital. He survived. And not only that, in the psychiatric facility where he was subsequently taken, they confirmed that he was indeed the missing peer, Jacobs. No one knew what had happened to him, neither mentally nor physically, but he was alive. Although, to my knowledge, he had never spoken a word again, let alone left the facility. I should also mention that, for reasons unknown to me, the police investigation was dropped. Perhaps they realized that I had acted in self-defense. Clara, Lars, and I were only questioned once. To be precise, the investigation ended quite abruptly after 2 employees from Lighthouse, a mysterious electrician company, as I discovered on the internet, paid a brief visit to our local police station. I had no idea what that was all about, but honestly, I didn't care. Of course, Dad gave me a house arrest and prohibited me from using my phone for a month because I had borrowed his rifle without permission. However, I knew deep down that he was secretly proud of me. I could tell by how he treated me since then. He didn't care if I lived a vegan lifestyle or not. And according to him, I was the talk of the town in his hunting club for quite a while. My world was back in order. Dear followers, I am pleased to announce my channel, Midnight Macabre, where you will find an exciting collection of horror stories. If you are a fan of thrills and suspense, this channel is specially designed for you. You will enjoy a unique and terrifying experience as I share chilling tales that will take you on a journey into the world of mystery and nightmares. Expect captivating details, creepy characters, and a focus on storytelling to stimulate your imagination and leave a lasting impression. I am eager to hear your feedback and suggestions regarding the stories and additional content you would like to see on the channel. Please subscribe to Midnight Macabre. Please subscribe to Midnight Macabre and activate notifications to be the first to receive the latest terrifying stories. Thank you very much for your support and participation in this haunting adventure. I look forward to seeing all of you on my channel. Best regards, Midnight Macabre.